in the mouse. Paul awoke with the eagerness of someone who has a very important, very serious meeting. He reached over to his alarm clock, turning it off before it sounded its calamity. Jean, Paul nudged his wife of 6 years gently. Jean, time to get up. Jean didn't stir. Paul teased the blanket down the bed, a playful smile on his face. Jean, now mostly exposed to a rather brisk morning, lay still. Paul sighed, tucking his darling back in. Paul reset the alarm and went about prepping for his day. He followed his usual routine of toilet, toast, coffee, then a nice hot shower to wake himself up. Hot water cascaded down Paul's body as he stood, head tilted towards the shower rose. Thump. Crash. Paul's safe, serene space shattered as his wife stormed in. Paul's brain jarred back to reality. Do hurry up now, it's time to go. You've been in there for nearly an hour. The dark, dripping eyes of a logical mind widened a little. His mouth moved a little before simply conceding and getting dressed. Whitewashed walls, quiet TVs, disinfected air, irrelevant magazines long out of date. It's a kind of hell, thought Paul, who waited for his wife. Feeling parched, and for a lack of better things to do, he walked down the hall to a vending machine. As Paul reached in for a Coke, an odd shadow caught on the corner of his eye. Upright on the wall was a featureless shadow of a person, two shadows extending from the carpet, running up into a shadow body with two arms, a head, and a strong presence. Paul let go of the Coke his hand had clasped. He walked back a few steps, eyes on the shadow. He then turned, hurrying back to the waiting room. He looked around worriedly before sitting down, still shaken. Paul was reciting his 5th prayer, the only thing a sane man could do in times like this. The doctor's door slowly opened. Jean smiled at Paul as she walked out. It was a shy, encouraging smile, her eyes glazed with tears not yet fallen. Paul shuffled to her, wanting to run, but knowing Jean wouldn't appreciate the attention. Jean cupped Paul's chin in her hand and whispered, "Simmons sees you. Go to the office." "You mean Dr. Carmen?" Paul answered hesitantly. Jean nodded. Paul entered the doctor's office. A small pale man sat behind a large wooden desk with a computer to one side. As many folders littered the floor as remained on the table. The desk was at an odd angle. "Please sit," said the doctor, wiping away sweat as if he'd just ran a marathon. "Are you okay?" Paul asked instinctively. "Paul, listen to me. I just had sex with your wife, and she's going to die." Paul's mind raced. His heart moved slow. "Paul, you're not going to react." Paul nodded his agreement. "Tonight, Paul, after you go to bed, I want you to lie very still for me. I want you to breathe and think, and you can talk, but only very quietly. Okay, Paul?" Paul nodded. "Act normal now. Your wife has cancer. Don't talk about anything else we've discussed, okay?" said Dr. Carmen. "Yes, Simmons," replied Paul. As the fated couple travelled home, Jean mainly sobbed. She told Paul Simmons asked her to do things, and she couldn't help it. Paul would only nod or comfort Jean, saying, "We'll find a cure." Paul went to bed early. The day had been long and strenuous. Jean was crying again in the spare room. Paul stretched out on the bed. He shut his eyes. Behind Paul's eyelids was a man bound from hair to toes in bandages. There was no jaw outline. The bandaged man had a tube where his chin should be. Whispers of Simmons swirled in Paul's dream. Pressure awoke Paul. Something on his hand. He looked down. Through blurry eyes he saw Jean licking his index finger. "Jean, baby," said Paul, quietly. Jean looked up into her beloved's eyes. Tears, rivers on her cheeks. Blood streamed from Paul's index finger. The pain, the shock, made Paul scream, except he decided it was better if he didn't. He moved to stop her and found he was too tired to move that much. Jean separated his fingernail from his skin, using only her mouth, and spat it out. "Jean, why?" was all Paul could stammer. "Simmons told me I can tell you that he's bored." "What do you mean, Jean? I don't understand." All Jean would reply was, though her eyes were filled with horror. Paul heard as much as he watched his lovely wife carefully break open his finger joints, separating his fingers into manageable bites. After eating all Paul's fingers, which took near 2 hours, after swallowing all the softer flesh and picking the bones clean, while Paul watched sobbing, groaning, begging, Jean left the room. Paul was in too much agony to know for how long. Jean returned with a can of petrol and something Paul couldn't make out behind her back. She turned away from him towards a dressing table. She plugged something in. Jean picked up the petrol can, stepping to clear Paul's view of their anniversary gift, a blender. "No, please no, no more," mumbled Paul. Jean splashed a little petrol into the blender. She turned it on. Then as Paul waited for her to use it on his, instead, Jean, staring Paul directly in the eyes, dipped her own hand into the buzzing blender. Skin and flesh quickly peeled away under the unforgiving metal. The blender got stuck on her bones now and then. All Paul could do was watch as she bobbed her arm up and down, giving the blender ample ramp-up opportunities. 11:45 struck. An alarm sounds on Jean's phone. Jean pulled her arm from the blender, some skin still dangling from her mangled stub. Jean laid next to Paul, laid the petrol can between them, petroleum lolling out into the bloody sheets covering the smell of raw meat. As midnight arrived, a presence seemed to depart the room. A shadow appeared on the wall near Paul, its presence putting pressure on the couple's existence. "Why?" Paul asked. The shadow didn't move or reply, but Paul did seem to see knowledge as from the point of question. Paul knew the shadow was late, and that Simmons could not be contained in life. And Jean spoke. "My love, Simmons says we can die." The fumes of petroleum ruptured with fire from the candle, burning a broken couple to ashes.